Caitlin Clark has become the most talked about player in women's basketball, and at this point, that isn't even debatable. Every major discussion in the WNBA somehow finds its way back to her. Whether the topic is television ratings, sold-out arenas, league growth, rivalries, media coverage, or social media controversy, Clark remains at the center of it all. But now a completely different conversation is beginning to dominate headlines. And unlike debates about basketball, this one isn't going away after the final buzzer over the last year. Multiple players, media personalities, and commentators have spoken publicly about online harassment, racist messages, and toxic behavior coming from certain corners of the internet. Some of those voices are now making a much bigger claim. They argue that a portion of Caitlin Clark's fan base has helped fuel that environment, and more importantly, they believe Clark herself has not done enough to stop it. That's where this story becomes explosive, because the criticism is no longer aimed at random social media users. It's being directed at the biggest star in the league. What's fascinating is that nobody is accusing Clark of sending hateful messages herself. Nobody is claiming she's responsible for every person who watches her games. Instead, critics are asking a different question entirely. When you become the face of a sport, do you also inherit responsibility for the culture that develops around you? Some commentators believe the answer is yes. They argue that Clark's platform is now so large that silence carries its own message. Others completely reject that idea, insisting that no athlete should be expected to answer for the actions of strangers on the internet. And right there is where this debate begins, because this is no longer a conversation about points, assists, or three-pointers. It's a conversation about influence. It's a conversation about responsibility. It's a conversation about race, perception, and the expectations that come with becoming the most powerful figure in a growing league. The question many critics are now asking isn't whether Caitlin Clark changed the WNBA forever. The question is whether she can continue staying on the sidelines of this particular conversation forever. And judging by the growing pressure surrounding her, more and more people believe that answer may eventually be no. And honestly, the reason this debate has become so intense is because both sides believe they're talking about something much bigger than Caitlin Clark herself. Critics aren't simply discussing one player, they're discussing influence. Well, they're discussing what happens when an athlete becomes so popular that an entirely new audience begins paying attention to a sport. Their argument is that with unprecedented influence comes unprecedented responsibility. That's why some media figures have pointed to stories from players and commentators who say they've received hateful messages, harassment, and abuse online. In their minds, these incidents aren't isolated. They're part of a larger pattern that deserves a much stronger response than what they've seen so far. At the same time, Clark supporters see the situation completely differently. They argue that Caitlin Clark has become a convenient target for problems that existed long before she entered the league. They point out that every superstar attracts extreme supporters, and every superstar attracts people who behave badly online. To them, holding Clark responsible for the actions of anonymous strangers makes no sense. They ask a simple question: if someone you've never met says something hateful on social media, when exactly does that become your responsibility? It's a question that sounds straightforward, but the answer has divided fans, media members, and even people inside the basketball world. What makes the discussion even more complicated is that both sides agree on certain things. Nobody is defending harassment. Nobody is defending racist messages. Nobody is defending threats directed at players or media personalities. The disagreement begins when the conversation shifts from condemning bad behavior to assigning responsibility for it. Critics argue that Clark's platform gives her the ability to influence the culture surrounding her fan base. Supporters argue that no public figure has the power to control millions of people. Somewhere between those two positions sits the heart of this controversy. And that's why the debate continues getting louder instead of fading away. The reality is that this conversation has now moved far beyond basketball. It's no longer about a box score or a highlight reel. It's about what society expects from athletes who become cultural icons. And whether Caitlin Clark wants to participate in that discussion or not, she's increasingly finding herself at the center of it. That's what makes this story so fascinating, because the pressure isn't coming from one direction anymore. It's coming from media members, players, commentators, and fans who all have very different ideas about what Clark should be doing next. And honestly, this is where the conversation starts becoming uncomfortable for everyone involved, because it forces people to confront a reality that many would rather avoid. The rise of Caitlin Clark didn't just bring new viewers to the WNBA, it brought new conversations, new political debates, new cultural arguments, and entirely new audiences that were never paying attention to the league before. Some people view that as a tremendous opportunity. Others view it as the source of many of the tensions we're seeing today. What was once primarily a basketball discussion now regularly turns into debates about race, identity, media narratives, and social issues. That's why every controversy seems to become larger than the actual event that started it. Critics of Clark argue that this is exactly why her voice matters. Their belief is that when someone reaches her level of influence, simply condemning bad behavior in general terms is no longer enough. They point to players who have publicly discussed receiving hateful messages and argue that stronger leadership is needed from the most recognizable figure in the league. In their minds, the issue isn't whether Clark personally agrees with any of the harassment. They know she doesn't. The issue is whether she has used the full weight of her platform to make her position impossible to misunderstand. That's why some commentators continue asking for more direct statements and more direct support for players who have found themselves targeted. Supporters immediately push back against that logic. They argue that Clark has already spoken against hateful behavior before, and that no statement would ever satisfy critics who have already decided she bears some responsibility. From their perspective, the expectations continue moving further and further. First, she's asked to condemn racism, then she's asked to be more specific, then she's asked to respond to individual incidents, then she's expected to address every controversy that appears online. To many supporters, it feels like an impossible standard that no athlete could realistically meet. They believe the conversation has reached a point where Clark is being judged not by what she says, but by what critics wish she would say. That's what makes this debate so difficult to resolve. Both sides believe they're defending something important. One side believes it's defending players who have been unfairly targeted. The other believes it's defending an athlete who is being unfairly blamed. And because both sides see themselves as standing on principle, neither side appears willing to back down. The result is a conversation that continues to grow larger with every passing month, creating more pressure on the league, more pressure on the media, and perhaps most importantly, more pressure on Caitlin Clark herself. Whether she likes it or not, she has become the central figure in a debate that stretches far beyond basketball. And there are increasing signs that people are no longer willing to let her remain a passive participant in it. What's fascinating about this entire situation is how quickly the discussion has shifted from what Caitlin Clark has actually done to what people believe she should do. That's a very important distinction. Even many of her harshest critics acknowledge that Clark herself is not the person sending hateful messages online. She isn't the one making racist comments. She isn't the one posting threats. Yet, somehow, she has become the focal point of the conversation anyway. That only happens when someone reaches a certain level of influence. At that point, people stop judging you solely by your actions and start judging you by your impact, your audience, and the culture that develops around you. The problem for Clark is that influence can be both a blessing and a burden. The same popularity that has made her one of the biggest stars in sports is also what makes every controversy feel attached to her. When television ratings rise, she's credited. When attendance records are broken, she's credited. When the league gains attention from mainstream media, she's credited. But critics argue that if she receives credit for the positive effects of her popularity, she can't completely separate herself from the negative consequences that come with it. Supporters strongly reject that logic, arguing that success and responsibility are not the same thing, and that no athlete should be expected to answer for every person who claims to be a fan. What makes this debate so difficult is that it's coming from every direction. Some people want Clark to become more outspoken. Others believe she's already said enough. Some think she should directly defend specific players whenever controversy arises. Others think doing that would only drag her deeper into endless political and social arguments that have nothing to do with basketball. Every group seems to have a different idea of what the right response looks like. The reality, however, is that no response would satisfy everyone. If she speaks more forcefully, some will say it's too late. If she stays focused on basketball, others will accuse her of avoiding the issue. It's the kind of situation where every choice creates a new headline, and that's why this conversation has become so important for the future of the WNBA itself. Because at its core, this isn't only about Caitlin Clark, it's about what happens when a league experiences explosive growth. Growth brings new fans. Growth brings new attention. Growth brings new opportunities. But growth also brings new tensions, new disagreements, and new challenges. The WNBA is experiencing all of those things at once right now. Fairly or unfairly, Caitlin Clark has become the face of that transformation, which means she's also become the face of many of the debates surrounding it. And as those debates continue to grow, so does the pressure on everyone involved to decide exactly what role they believe the biggest star in the league should play. But honestly, this is where the entire debate reaches its most difficult point because it forces people to answer a question that doesn't have a clean solution. What exactly would be enough? If Caitlin Clark released another statement tomorrow condemning racism and harassment, would the criticism stop? If she specifically defended players by name, would that end the conversation? If she spent an entire press conference discussing the issue, would everyone suddenly agree that she had done her part? Looking at how this debate has evolved over the last year, the answer appears to be no. That's what makes the situation so complicated. The discussion has moved beyond any single statement and entered the realm of perception, where different groups are often looking at the same events and seeing completely different realities. For critics, every new incident reinforces the belief that stronger leadership is needed. They see a pattern, and they believe patterns require action. They argue that the issue isn't whether Clark personally agrees with hateful behavior. They know she doesn't. The issue in their minds is whether she has fully used the influence available to her. That's why some commentators continue pushing for stronger responses. They're not talking about one controversy, but they're talking about what they see as a larger responsibility that comes with being the most influential figure in the sport. Supporters, however, see the situation in almost the exact opposite way. They believe the expectations being placed on Clark have become impossible to satisfy. From their perspective, every time she addresses the issue, the demands simply grow larger. First, she's asked to condemn harassment. Then she's asked to be more specific. Then she's asked to mention names. Then she's expected to respond every time a new controversy emerges. To them, the finish line keeps moving. That's why many Clark supporters believe this conversation is no longer about finding solutions. They believe it's become a cycle where no response will ever be viewed as sufficient. What makes all of this even more significant is that it extends beyond Caitlin Clark herself. The WNBA is experiencing a level of attention it has never seen before. With that attention comes scrutiny. With scrutiny comes disagreement, and with disagreement comes pressure. The league is learning that rapid growth doesn't just bring new fans and bigger ratings. It also brings complicated questions that don't have easy answers. Right now, many of those questions are being directed toward the biggest star in the sport. Whether that's fair or unfair depends on who you ask. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear: this conversation isn't disappearing anytime soon. And neither is the expectation that Clark will eventually have to decide exactly how she wants to respond to it. And honestly, that's why this debate has become so polarizing. At this point, people are no longer arguing about what happened. They're arguing about what it means. One side looks at the controversy and sees a superstar who has benefited enormously from the spotlight while avoiding some of the responsibilities that come with it. The other side sees a young athlete who has been asked to carry burdens that no individual player could realistically be expected to carry. Those two perspectives are so fundamentally different that it's becoming almost impossible to find common ground between them. What makes the situation even more fascinating is that Caitlin Clark herself rarely seems interested in becoming the center of these discussions. Time and time again, she has tried to redirect attention back toward basketball, toward her teammates, toward the season, and toward the game itself. Yet no matter how often she attempts to move the conversation, it keeps finding its way back to her. That's usually a sign that a debate has grown beyond the person at the center of it. The discussion is no longer being driven by Clark, it's being driven by what she represents to different groups of people. And once somebody becomes a symbol, controlling the narrative becomes almost impossible. For some observers, Clark represents the future of the WNBA. For others, she represents a complicated shift in how the league is covered, discussed, and consumed. For some fans, she's simply an incredible basketball player. For others, she's become a cultural figure whose influence extends far beyond sports. That's why every statement, every decision, and every silence gets interpreted through completely different lenses depending on who's watching. One person sees professionalism, another sees avoidance, one person sees restraint, another sees indifference. The same moment produces entirely different conclusions, and that's probably why this conversation isn't ending anytime soon. The people demanding more from Clark believe they're asking for leadership. The people defending Clark believe they're protecting fairness. Neither side views itself as unreasonable, which means neither side is likely to back down. The result is a debate that continues growing larger with every controversy, every headline, and every new opinion that enters the conversation. Whether Clark eventually decides to address it more directly or continues focusing on basketball, one thing is clear: this discussion has become part of the story surrounding her career. And it isn't going away anytime soon. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Caitlin Clark has done enough to address the behavior of the most extreme parts of her fan base? Or do you think critics are expecting far too much from one athlete? And another question, where should the line be drawn between influence and responsibility? Should a superstar be expected to speak out every time controversy appears around their name? Or is it unfair to hold them accountable for the actions of strangers they have never met? Drop your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because we've got more Caitlin Clark and WNBA coverage coming, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.